Okay, so we've got W, R, and S, and we're asked to find the midpoint W. So for this problem, we were given a negative number, and sometimes that can be elusive in regards to midpoint, albeit -6. And they also said give RS, but when you write this out in this direction, it would seem like you're doing this, and that's all well and good, and that's also okay. And another thing is when it comes to negative numbers is sometimes there's this point of confusion for students and almost anyone when it comes to this, and that's because you involve anything below zero, and these positive numbers kind of respectfully sop up the value as you're going from left to right. But remember, we are dealing with a number line, so the negative numbers are going to exist on this line, and that's primarily why it can seem confusing. But you're always going to use the exact number you're given, right? And plug that into your midpoint formula. So that's -6 plus 4 divided by 2. That's going to give you, of course, -2 divided by 2 is -1. So that would be the midpoint. But right off the bat, it almost kind of seems like, well, where does this come from? Because I know that the midpoint, that's S to this midpoint W, is definitely going to be 5 units here. But where does the 5 come from, right? There's a bit of confusion as to where this 5 comes from and why it exists, and you would have guessed it, and I'm going to prove it over here to the left as to why it does. Now, what I mean to say is if that -1 is your endpoint, right? If you've got the boundary -6 and R, if you use your formula, or -6 respectively, and 4, sorry. If you use your formula, you will get, in fact, that midpoint, if you use it accurately. But I'm going to show you kind of I don't want to call it inaccurate, because it is definitely kind of a justification. I'm going to do that in white as to why we're getting this 5 units here. Now, it stands to reason if that's 5 units here, right, that's going to be 5 to that midpoint, then it also should be 5 from this midpoint, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So already we have some sort of relation that we might be able to justify mathematically, but we can definitely see that it is 5 to the left and 5 to the right. This is a little more confusing because we are involving negative numbers once more. So let's go ahead and let's analyze this just a little deeper if we can. So if you've got this midpoint W, that's going to be your -1. So W is in fact the midpoint and equal to -1. So I'm going to prove this to you. So you've got this total distance, right? And when you're measuring distance, you have to definitely do what you might assume. You have to subtract one of your points from the other, albeit it needs to be in this direction, right? Because we're dealing with a negative to positive. So even if you wrote it this way, that's perfectly fine. But to better understand this, you really should have your -6 over here. And I did it this way because it says RS, and you might be inclined to do this, and it might trip you up. It doesn't matter, right? Because the distance is always going to be positive. It's going to be the absolute value from point R to point S, or point S to point R. It's going to be the same distance no matter what direction you go. And they were trying to trip you up in this paper, it seems, or maybe they didn't know, one way or the other. When you do this, if you want to find the total distance, that means the actual distance traversed from S to R. You're definitely going to have this total distance being 4 minus -6, right? And the reason this is because when we're talking about positive numbers, you do have to count the amount of times you're going in this direction. So -4, -3, -2, -1, it's not to scale. That would be 5 units already. So I want you to understand when you look at this, this is where this 5 is coming from. I'll show you that in a moment. But the total distance is going to be 10, of course. 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Of course, it's not to scale. So 4 minus a -6, you have to accrue for the fact that you're counting positive numbers up until 4, so you have to do 4 minus -6. Okay, now that's going to give you a positive 10, right? Okay, so that's going to be the total distance. If I cut that total distance in half, then it stands to reason then 5 units from either point will get me to that midpoint. So let's look at point S, and let's go ahead and let's look to what we originally did when we used our formula over here. So if you use your formula and you start at S, we're going to count 5 units. 1, tracing these blue, 2, 3, 4, 5, and voila, look, you got to your midpoint. Now the question arises, which formula do you use, Colton? You just use 2 formulas. Well, you're definitely going to use the one that I have here. You're going to put the signs that you have respectfully into your formula. So you'll have whatever sign you have for your first coordinate. we'll just use x for this. And you're going to put whatever sign you have into this coordinate. That plus is always going to be there, but whatever sign you put, you have to make sure that you do put that sign in there. That's what I'm putting in parentheses for you. You don't have to use parentheses. You might as a safety net. This is why I have this here, so you know that you can in fact put negative and positive numbers in here. You don't have to put a plus sign for the positive. You know positive if you see it. So, but this is definitely going to be the formula you use, or you can just use the typical one that you always see. But just make sure that you do include those negative numbers, and this formula does work. In fact, do you have to do the justification? No, I simply did this to show you that in some problems it does arrive when you need to find the total distance and maybe count how many you are from one or the other. Maybe they want you to find point R, but in this problem, all they're asking for is the midpoint, so you can use, I'll say formula 2, right, which is going to be consistent of these two formulas. So you can use either one of these or the same thing. Over here, I'm just proving it for you. We call this a justification, so you don't have to use it, but that's where that elusive 5 units comes from, and that'll conclude the bulk of this video.